During a quiet spring cleaning at the village church, an old, moth-eaten chest is discovered. Inside lies a forgotten wedding dress, yellowed with age, yet silently screaming to be heard. But Miss Marple's eyes catch what others miss: a seam, oddly thick, strangely placed, as if stitched not just with thread, but with secrets. A bride who never reached the altar, and a truth, buried in fabric, now slowly unraveling with time. The puzzle in the wedding dress. The morning sun, gentle and unhurried, filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mildred's, casting long, colored shapes upon the flagstone floor. Within the quiet vestry, the faint scent of lavender polish mingled with the must of hymn books and old cedar. It was spring cleaning day, a village ritual carried out more for form than necessity, though the vicar's wife, Mrs. Edith Cranley, liked to declare that cleanliness was next to godliness, particularly when Easter approached. Among the handful of women bending to the task of dusting candlesticks and polishing brass was Miss Marple, unassuming in her pale gray cardigan, who preferred dusting the hymnals and arranging the seasonal flowers in their urn jars. She rarely commented, but missed nothing. Her hands, though slight, were efficient. Her eyes, behind her wire-rimmed spectacles, moved with quiet purpose. The conversation among the women was light. Remarks about Mrs. Petton's lambing troubles, the price of marmalade oranges, and the mystery of who had borrowed the brass bell rope without returning it. Nothing, it seemed, was out of the ordinary, until Mrs. Cranley gave a small cry near the back wall, where a moth-eaten curtain had been drawn aside to reveal a chest no one quite remembered seeing before. The cedar chest, large and dull with age, sat askew behind a pile of unused kneelers and a disused flower stand. The hinges groaned slightly as Mrs. Cranley lifted the lid, releasing a cloud of stale air, with the scent of long unopened linen. The women leaned in, a mixture of curiosity and hesitance, as though the very dust within the chest might carry a story. Inside lay folded cloth, creamy, yellowed with age, but remarkably intact. Mrs. Cranley reached in and lifted the top layer. What emerged was unmistakable, a wedding dress, delicate in style, with an Edwardian modesty, a high collar and lace-cuffed sleeves. It was the kind of garment that spoke of another era's restraint and grace. The women murmured in surprise. "Now who would have left that here?" asked Mrs. Finch, shaking her head. But Miss Marple said nothing. Her fingers gently touched the fabric, noting the fine stitching, the unusual weight at the bodice, the incongruous thickness of one seam. Her expression did not change, yet her thoughts stirred. "No label," murmured Mrs. Cranley, "but there are initials sewn in." She turned the hem slightly, e.g. Miss Marple looked up. "Elenina Gray," she said softly, as though recalling an old, unfinished sentence. It was not the beauty of the dress that captured Miss Marple's attention, but its inconsistencies. The bodice, though finely sewn, bore a seam far thicker than its counterparts, as though someone had added, or hidden, something beneath. It puckered slightly under the left sleeve, where a natural drape should have fallen smooth. Her fingertips brushed that section with delicate precision, feeling something not quite part of the original design. She did not comment immediately, allowing the other ladies to marvel and speculate as they folded the dress back into the chest. But even as Mrs. Cranley discussed the possibility of presenting it at the next harvest exhibition, Miss Marple's mind had already wandered to a time when such dresses were not relics, but promises. The initials confirmed her suspicion. There had been an Elenina Gray in Little Brackham, once, many years ago. A quiet girl, softly spoken, with a fondness for bluebells and church music. She had been set to marry one Hugh Weatherbeebe, whose family kept Greyhoor Farm. And then, well, then she had vanished. Without explanation, without trace. The seam in the dress seemed to whisper of unfinished things. Miss Marple began to listen more closely. It was Edith Cranley who, over tea in the vicarage that very afternoon, filled in the gaps with the ease of someone who had heard the tale a dozen times, and yet never quite believed it. She was meant to marry Hugh Weatherbeebe, Edith said, placing the teapot carefully upon the tray. And everyone was at the church that morning, the flowers, the choir, even that dreadful cousin of hers who wore purple to a morning ceremony. And then nothing. Ellalinina never arrived. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, not interrupting. They said she ran away. Edith continued. Some claimed she had a lover in London. Others whispered about nerves, inheritance disagreements, or a pregnancy. But no body, no letter, no sign. Hugh waited for over an hour before the vicar called the whole thing off. And what became of Hugh? Miss Marple asked, with the mildness of one idly curious. Oh, he married Ellalinina's cousin Margaret a year later. The family insisted on keeping things quiet. Margaret was always the practical one. Miss Marple nodded faintly. It was all quite proper and quite suspicious. Vanishing brides did not simply fold themselves into legend. They lingered, especially in quiet places like Little Brackham, where history did not fade, so much as settle into dust. Later that day, back in her cottage garden, Miss Marple found her hands pruning rosebuds, while her mind wandered steadily to the dress, the seam, and the name Ellalinina Gray. Memories fluttered like petals, of village dances where Ellalinina stood apart, of how Mrs. Weatherbeeby, Hugh's mother, had once been heard saying she would never allow her son to marry for foolish reasons. The roses, pale and pink, had survived a late frost that year, and Miss Marple noted their resilience, with some reflection. People, like roses, often kept their secrets beneath appearances, thriving where they should not, or wilting when expected to bloom. She remembered Ellalinina's quiet nature, her uncertain eyes, the way she always looked slightly over her shoulder, as though waiting for something to catch her up. And she thought, too, of the way Edith Cranley had hesitated before recounting the story, not embellishing it, but softening it, as if a truth had long been sewn into the village's memory and carefully stitched shut. Miss Marple had always believed that fabric held more than wear. It held impressions, warmth, and sometimes, if one looked closely, confessions. Returning quietly to the church the following morning, Miss Marple brought her sewing scissors, tucked discreetly into her handbag. The vestry was unattended. The spring cleaning had been concluded. Mrs. Cranley had left the chest respectfully closed, but unlocked. Miss Marple moved with care, lifting the dress once more into the light. She turned it, her fingers expertly seeking the uneven seam across the bodice. With the soft snip of steel, she opened the thread, precise, delicate, controlled. The seam gave way without resistance, and within it lay a faint crinkle of paper, folded, old, and browned with age. It bore the faintest perfume, now faded, and the edges were crumbling. She did not open it there. Some secrets should be read in silence, not under the gaze of the saints carved above the vest shelf. She tucked the paper into her notebook, and refolded the dress as though nothing had passed. But something had. The seam had split, and the past had begun to speak. Miss Marple knew, from long years of quiet listening, that time did not erase the truth. It only hid it, and even then, not very well. The dress, it seemed, had never been worn, but it had carried something far heavier than silk. In the quiet lattice of village memory, there are stories that never quite settle, but drift, from season to season, like the dust on chapel rafters. The disappearance of Ellalinina Gray was one such tale in Little Brackham, not retold openly, yet never quite extinguished. Her name was rarely spoken now, except in cautious half-recollections or whispered during spring cleanings, when the church brought forth its forgotten relics. Ellalinina had vanished, not in a romantic flourish or dramatic exodus, but quietly, almost respectfully. One moment she had been the picture of restrained elegance, a bride, prepared for her nuptials. The next, she was simply gone. No witness saw her leave the church, and no one could say where she went. There was no scandal made of it. The vicar made a short statement. The congregation dispersed, and the family, bound by pride and silence, drew the matter inward. Miss Marple, who had already begun to take notice of the peculiarities of human nature by that time, remembered the hush that followed Ellalinina's vanishing. It had not been the hush of mourning, nor of shame exactly, but the sort reserved for matters that polite company did not discuss unless prompted. And now, with the dress unearthed, and its odd seam hinting at secrets long buried, the hush was beginning to stir again, brittle and ready to fracture. The drawing-room of Mrs. Bantry's house had long served as a gentle arena for opinion and curiosity. to circle each other beneath the guise of sociable civility. On this particular afternoon, as the clock chimed 3, Miss Marple found herself seated with Mrs. Bantry and Miss Litton, a retired schoolteacher whose memory remained keen where village gossip was concerned, even if her eyesight had failed her somewhat. Conversation began, as it often did, with unthreatening matters, the dubious quality of the grocer's new tea blend, and a passing remark on the bishop's niece's unsuitably short engagement. But as Miss Marple, with a casual air, mentioned the wedding dress found in the vestry, a faint tension crept into the air, like the tightening of lace. "Ellalinina Gray," said Mrs. Bantry, placing her cup down rather too carefully. Now there was a curious affair. Miss Litton, who had taught both Ellalinina and her cousin Margaret arithmetic years before, nodded slowly. The child had a melancholy nature, but that may have been her upbringing. Her father kept a firm hand, and her mother died so young. "And Hugh Weatherbeeby?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Bantry gave a little shrug. "Devoted to Ellalinina. But men are resilient. He married Margaret soon enough." What was not said hung more thickly than the scent of lemon biscuits. That love, inheritance, and pride rarely made a harmonious trio. The women's recollections, though softened by time, revealed certain patterns. Ellalinina, it seemed, had not been universally admired. Some found her too reserved, too sensitive. Others pitied her. The only child of a controlling father, and heir to a modest but noteworthy property adjoining Greyhoor Farm, her match with Hugh Weatherbeeby had been deemed appropriate, if not entirely inspired. Yet, as the conversation unfolded, Miss Marple noted inconsistencies. One neighbor had remarked at the time that Ellalinina had been seen speaking to a stranger by the post office a week before the wedding. Another, Mrs. Paretta from the haberdashery, recalled Ellalinina coming in for blue silk ribbon and being quite distracted, her cheeks all flushed, and not from the weather. There were whispers, long buried, that Ellalinina may have had a suitor in London, her cousin from her mother's side, or perhaps someone she met while visiting Bath. But such talk had always been brushed aside by the Grey family as romantic nonsense. It did not fit the tidy narrative they preferred, that Ellalinina was delicate, easily overwhelmed, and not suited to the practical realities of marriage and land. Miss Marple, who knew that silence often concealed far more than words ever did, made mental note of each discrepancy, and when she walked home through the lane, lined with fading crocuses, she could not help but wonder whether Ellalinina's vanishing had less to do with nerves and more to do with rebellion or danger. It was 2 days later that Miss Marple made her way, quite politely, and with a small jar of homemade quince jelly, to Greyhoor Farm. The Weatherbeebys, or rather Margaret, now widowed these many years, remained at the farmhouse. Much of the land had been leased out to a neighboring dairy concern. The house itself stood as it always had, with ivy climbing up one side, and a faint air of weary gentility clinging to its windows. Margaret greeted Miss Marple with a careful smile. She was a woman whose voice never rose above necessity, and whose eyes retained the watchfulness of someone who had once been forced to justify her happiness. The drawing-room bore the marks of faded ambition. Good furniture covered with antimacassars, and a portrait of Hugh in his later years above the hearth. They spoke of mild things at first, the marmalade competition at the Women's Institute, the unreliability of chimney sweeps, and the bishop's latest sermon. Miss Marple, gently as ever, mentioned the dress found in the church. "A wedding dress," Margaret repeated, pausing mid-stir of her tea. "Oh, Ellalinina's, perhaps. Goodness, I thought that had been given to the poor box." She said it lightly, but Miss Marple noted how her hand gripped the spoon too tightly, the knuckles blanching. It was not panic, but discomfort, and discomfort, Miss Marple well knew, often pointed the way to buried truths, waiting to be disinterred. Margaret Weatherbeeby was not, by nature, a nervous woman. She had managed a household, a husband, and a farm during years both prosperous and lean. Yet the mention of Ellalinina's wedding dress seemed to cast a faint shadow across her composure, as though a draught had crept into the room that could not be traced to any window left ajar. She stirred her tea, twice, needlessly, and then changed the subject with practiced cheerfulness. speaking of new curtains for the parlor and the return of her niece from Surrey. But her sentences ran slightly ahead of themselves, as if hoping to outrun a thought not yet fully formed. Miss Marple, who had long observed the difference between forgetfulness and avoidance, let the conversation drift. But her attention did not. Margaret's responses had been too swift, too rehearsed, too eager to dismiss the matter of the dress as unimportant. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced once more at the portrait of Hugh Weatherby, and wondered what his eyes might have seen in the years between two cousins, one lost and one left behind. As Margaret walked Miss Marple to the door, a small glint caught the older lady's eye, not from the window sill or the vase of daffodils, but from Margaret's neck. There, tucked just beneath the collar of her blouse, hung a delicate gold locket on a chain that did not match the rest of her attire. It was not the ornament itself that drew Miss Marple's attention, but rather its familiarity. She had seen Evelina Gray wear a locket just like it, many years ago during choir practice. A simple thing, with a blue enamel clasp, delicate and distinct. The kind of trinket not easily forgotten, nor easily acquired twice. Margaret noticed Miss Marple's glance, and for a moment her fingers lifted instinctively toward the chain, as though to check its presence or guard it from question. Then she smiled, too swiftly. "An old keepsake," she said, not elaborating. Miss Marple made no comment, offered her farewell, and stepped out into the cool afternoon light. But as she walked back along the bridle path, she carried with her the quiet certainty that some heirlooms were not inherited by permission. They were taken by opportunity, and worn by those who had not been meant to wear them. It was on a mild Thursday morning that a stranger arrived in Little Brackham, his boots clean, his coat of good London cut, and his manner pleasantly self-effacing. The newcomer, who introduced himself as Mr. Gideon Gray, explained, with polite modesty, that he was in pursuit of some family history. He had been tracing his lineage, he said, and believed he might be distantly connected to the Grays of Greyhoor Farm. The vicar, who happened to be trimming the church hedge when Mr. Gray made his first inquiries, was both delighted and slightly flustered. It was not often that Little Brackham received visitors with genealogical intent, and the connection to the long-departed Evelina Gray lent the visit a whisper of romantic tragedy, just the kind of tale that village conversations quietly cherish. Miss Marple, who heard of Mr. Gray's arrival through Mrs. Bantry, listened without comment. A man turning up after 50 years to inquire about a vanished woman might seem innocent enough, but the timing, so soon after the discovery of the dress, struck her as more than coincidence. She did not say so, but she noted the name, and the poise, and the particular way he spoke of the past, not with nostalgia, but with deliberation, and that, in Miss Marple's experience, often meant something was being sought, beyond mere facts. Mr. Gray proved to be a visitor of admirable manners. He attended Sunday service, complimented the flower arrangements with the tact of one accustomed to village sensibilities, and made casual inquiries in the post-office queue that revealed far more than they seemed to ask. His primary interest, it appeared, lay not in the broader branches of the Gray family, but in Evelina herself. He expressed polite curiosity about her disappearance, whether there had ever been a search, whether she had written to anyone, whether the church had retained any record of her banns. He asked about the Weatherbys, about the farm, and about Margaret, always gently, always with the quiet air of one doing no more than fulfilling an old family duty. But Miss Marple had long believed that the most dangerous questions are the ones asked without urgency. It was not what Mr. Gray said, it was how he asked. His gaze lingered not on the places or the names, but on the absences between them. He never expressed sorrow, only curiosity, and he never once asked why Evelina had disappeared, only what was known, and who had inherited what. Such pointed interest was not the mark of sentimental kinship. It was the careful excavation of someone with a map, looking for a chest long buried, and who believed he was getting close. The Reverend Mr. Ininsley, a man with an enduring fondness for ecclesiastical ledgers and visiting clergy, took a particular liking to Gideon Gray, flattered by his respectful tone and seemingly sincere reverence for the church's role in village life. The vicar soon granted him access to the dusty, seldom disturbed records stored in the vestry's old writing desk. These included the registers of baptism, banns, and burials, carefully maintained, if yellowing, which Mr. Gray perused over several quiet afternoons, seated beneath the east window. His attention lingered on a few select entries: the recording of Elalina Gay's banns with Hugh Weatherbeebe, the absence of a subsequent marriage record, and a notation in the margin, long faded, suggesting that the wedding was postponed, with no explanation provided. Miss Marple, who happened to pass through the vestry to arrange the altar flowers one of those days, exchanged a few pleasant remarks with the visitor. He was courteous as ever, though his interest in Elalina seemed less that of a grieving descendant and more of a man verifying an account. When asked if he had known her, he replied simply that family stories often held more questions than answers, and that he had always felt there was something unfinished. He smiled when he said it, a smile Miss Marple found perfectly rehearsed. Mr. Cresswell, the local solicitor, had long been the guardian of little Brackham's more delicate legal matters, wills, land deeds, and the occasional family dispute over a missing brooch or a contested gravestone. He was not known for sentiment, but for discretion, and it was to him that Mr. Gray turned next. Their conversation, conducted behind the frosted glass of the solicitor's office, was not publicly known in detail, but the outcome became evident soon enough when Mr. Cresswell began speaking in guarded terms about the legal implications of Elalina's disappearance. If, as he explained to a few selected listeners at the Red Fox luncheon table, Elalina had, in fact, married and borne a child, any remaining inheritance would technically descend through that line, even if she herself had died without reclaiming her position. This revelation carried with quiet haste through the village, lighting a small flame of speculation. Had Eleanor fled to avoid disgrace? Had she married in secret? And was Mr. Gray the result of that union? Or was he merely stirring old dust for reasons of gain? Miss Marple remained silent, but her thoughts stirred. The law, she knew, followed paper, but truth, particularly in villages, followed silence, and it was often the solicitor who held both. As days passed, Mr. Gray was invited for tea by no fewer than 5 households, including the vicarage and the widow Ashcraft-Toft, who had not entertained a gentleman caller since the last Harvest Fair Committee disbanded. He listened attentively, spoke with warmth, and never once appeared to press. His questions, when they came, were tucked between compliments and polite concern. The villagers, for the most part, found him charming, a man of education, respectful of traditions, and with that faint London crispness that lent him a touch of exoticism. But Miss Marple, who had seen charm used both for courtship and concealment, regarded him rather differently. She noticed how he never failed to ask about Elalina's final days, but never asked about her childhood. He sought records, not memories, facts, not affection. She also observed how he watched people's reactions, not for grief, but for discomfort. And then there was the matter of timing. The dress discovered, the stranger arriving, the solicitor whispering of inheritance. Something had stirred, not by accident, but by design. The vestry chest, having once slumbered undisturbed beneath the sanctuary wall for half a century, suffered a quiet indignity that following week. The church cleaner, arriving early to arrange hymnals, found the lid slightly ajar. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The vestments were neatly folded, the candlesticks untouched, and yet the wedding dress, so carefully refolded by Miss Marple only days before, now bore a new crease, one that had not been there previously. Mrs. Cranley insisted it had simply shifted. The vicar muttered something about mice, but Miss Marple, who examined the chest discreetly later that day, noted the faintest scuff upon the inside lid, as though someone unfamiliar with the mechanism had forced it open from the side. Nothing was missing, nothing obvious, at least. And yet the intrusion had occurred, not for mischief, nor for petty theft. No, this had been an examination, a verification, perhaps even a confirmation. The dress, after all, had once carried something within it, and Miss Marple began to wonder whether it still did, or whether someone else now held what it had hidden. The storm arrived just after luncheon, sudden and unseasonal, churning over little Brackham with the sort of petulant ferocity that April sometimes delivered, as if to remind the village of its insignificance. Most retreated indoors, drew curtains, turned teacups upright in their saucers. But at Greyhoor Farm, Margaret Wetherby had, most unusually, taken her seat in the garden chair near the yew hedge, and remained there through the gathering wind. When the storm passed and the light returned with its customary serenity, it was the maid, a plain girl called Etty, with a slight limp and a sharp sense of when silence became suspicious, who found her. Margaret sat upright, as though merely resting, but her expression bore the unnatural calm that follows sudden death. The doctor, summoned with appropriate haste, pronounced it heart failure, possibly brought on by the weather. There was no mark upon her, no disorder to the surrounding garden, no witness to contradiction. Neighbors expressed muted sorrow. She had seemed well enough, if a little pale of late. The timing was unfortunate, or perhaps convenient, depending upon one's disposition, coming so soon after the arrival of Mr. Gray, and the reawakening of old whispers. Mrs. Cranley observed rather too brightly that perhaps Margaret had never fully recovered from Hugh's passing years before. But Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, simply folded her knitting and asked whether Margaret had been wearing her locket, the one with the blue enamel clasp. For reasons she did not immediately share, that question struck her as more pressing than the doctor's report. The villagers, for the most part, accepted the doctor's explanation without dispute. Margaret Wetherby had been in her 70s, had lived through personal loss and seasonal ailments, and heart failure was as dignified a departure as any. Yet Miss Marple had always mistrusted convenient endings, particularly those that arrived during inclement weather and were followed by tidy silences. Margaret, as Miss Marple well remembered, had possessed a deep-rooted fear of storms. It was a trait remarked upon more than once by neighbors, and confirmed by the maid, who said that Margaret would usually retreat to the parlor with a shawl and her needlework the moment clouds began to gather, that she had chosen, or been made, to remain outdoors during the worst of it struck Miss Marple as not only strange, but unnatural. And then there was the matter of the missing locket. Margaret had worn it consistently since Hugh's death, fingering it absently during conversations, even once refusing to remove it during a chest x-ray. That it should be absent without mention and never recovered from the chair or the house raised more than an eyebrow. The heart may have stopped for natural reasons, but the circumstances surrounding it were beginning to feel anything but. Greyhoor Farm, though no longer under Hugh Wetherby's practical care, still bore his influence in its modest upkeep and well-worn routines. Miss Marple found him seated near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, attended by Etty the maid, whose loyalty to the household had outlasted more than one mistress. His eyes, once clear and steady, were now veiled with age, though they still flickered with recognition when Miss Marple addressed him. Their conversation began with condolences, gently worded, and was received with the weary gratitude of a man who had already begun the slow sorting of grief from memory. When she inquired about Margaret's recent state of mind, Hugh responded slowly, as though picking his way through brittle recollections. "She'd been restless," he murmured. "Kept talking about Eleanor. Not openly, mind you. Just little things. Said the past was too loud. That's what she said, too loud." He admitted that Margaret had grown nervous since the arrival of Mr. Gray, though she had not spoken ill of him directly. Once, he recalled, she had thrown a letter into the fire before he could read it, something in a blue envelope. And lately, she had kept to the garden more often than usual, watching the road. Miss Marple listened, storing the phrases that mattered. The past rarely made noise without a reason, and when it did, it seldom left the living undisturbed. Etty, the maid at Greyhoor Farm, was not a talkative girl by nature. Years of quiet service and a subtle limp had trained her in discretion. She held her opinions the way one held folded linen, neat, unassuming, and rarely offered unless pressed. But grief, like steam, has a way of loosening sealed lids, and as the house mourned Margaret's sudden passing, Etty found herself confiding in Miss Marple one rainy morning over a basket of ironing. She had heard voices, she said, not shouting exactly, but firm, quick words exchanged behind the closed parlor door the evening before Margaret died. Margaret's voice had been tight, angry even, and someone else, a man, had responded in low tones. Eddie had not caught all the words, but one phrase stood out, repeated twice. The letters. She was never supposed to come back. It had struck her as strange. There had been no mention of visitors that evening, and no name she could place to the voice. But the door had remained shut for nearly half an hour, and when it opened, Margaret had emerged pale and trembling. She had said nothing. That night, she barely touched her supper and retired early. Miss Marple thanked the girl gently, but her thoughts had already shifted. Letters, a secret, and someone who feared the return of a truth long buried. Though the doctor's report had declared there was nothing suspicious about Margaret's death, Miss Marple was never one to dismiss small incongruities, particularly those that lingered like perfume after the wearer had gone. Her return to Greyhoor Farm, ostensibly to offer a jar of preserved greengage, was brief and understated, but it allowed her a quiet moment alone in the garden, where the chair still stood, empty and unremarkable. The grass beneath it had been flattened by the storm, and most items had already been tidied away by the maid. Yet beneath the rear leg of the wooden frame, pressed into the damp earth, was a slender strip of blue ribbon. It was silk of an older weave, and bore faint traces of embroidery, once vibrant, though now faded. Miss Marple recognized it at once. It matched in color and texture the sash once sewn onto the waist of Evelina Gay's wedding dress. No one had seen such ribbon in decades. It had not been part of the vestry display, and it had certainly not been worn by Margaret in recent years. And yet, here it lay near her final resting place, as if dropped in haste or torn loose in a moment of struggle. It was not proof, not yet, but it was evidence of a connection that had been hidden, and perhaps of a presence that had returned to tie the past once more to the present. The wedding dress had remained in the vestry chest since its discovery, folded with modest care, untouched since Miss Marple's first inspection. But now, with Margaret dead and the ribbon recovered, Miss Marple returned to it with a renewed sense of urgency, not to admire the garment, but to examine its unspoken story. She waited until the church was empty, mid-morning on a Thursday, when Mrs. Cranley had gone to visit her cousin in Hatherham and the cleaner had already finished her rounds. With quiet hands and an air of firm deliberation, Miss Marple lifted the dress once more and laid it out across the table used for flower arrangements. Her fingers, experienced with fabric and far older secrets, moved to the seam she had noted days before, that thick, uneven line across the left bodice. Taking her small sewing scissors from her handbag, she carefully unpicked the stitches, revealing a slender cavity within the lining. Folded there, pressed flat as though hidden in haste, was a letter, aged, browned at the corners, and faintly water-stained, as though it had once been read and wept over before being concealed. The paper bore a delicate floral border and ink in a hurried hand. Though the handwriting was partially blurred, the message was unmistakable in its tone. It spoke of love, fear, and the danger of discovery. It warned of someone watching. It mentioned a child, and it was signed only with initials, Th. Miss Marple folded the letter again, gently. She did not yet know what it proved, but she knew without doubt that someone else feared what this letter now whispered. Miss Marple had long learned that the past rarely concealed itself with complete success. Threads may be sewn, locks fastened, and names hushed, but truth has a particular way of lingering, like the scent of lavender in a locked drawer. When she opened the seam of the wedding gown, she did so with neither haste nor theatricality, only with the firm precision of someone seeking not gossip, but understanding. The stitching had been done by hand, not recently, but with the care of someone desperate to conceal. The lining parted under gentle fingers, revealing the carefully folded envelope, no longer sealed but pressed closed, as if even the letter itself had wished to remain unread. It bore no address and no name on the outside, though time had yellowed its edges and moisture had faintly blurred the corners. The paper inside, once white, bore a faint floral border and a hurried hand. The ink, though faded, retained its urgency. Miss Marple read it slowly, not out of age, but reverence. The words revealed not only the passion of the writer, but the fragility of the woman for whom they were meant. Love, fear, and secrecy, all bound tightly within the folds of a gown never worn. The initials at the end, Th, were unfamiliar, but their sincerity was unmistakable. And Miss Marple knew, as only she could, that the next step would not lie in speculation, but in the finding of a name. The letter, though brief, cast a long shadow. It had been written in haste, likely just days before the fateful wedding, and bore the tremble of someone desperate, yet determined. Its writer, Vance, made it under cover of darkness, to meet Elena on the morning of her wedding, to escape before the bells rang. There were no flowery declarations, no indulgent phrases, only simple, urgent lines. He wrote of the child she carried. Our little one, he called it, and of his determination to shield both mother and child from Elena's father, whose disapproval had apparently reached the level of threat. The man had been a soldier, stationed nearby, and now granted brief leave. There was mention of a small inheritance, just enough for travel and survival. He asked Elena to bring only what she must, and to leave the dress, a decoy, to buy time. Miss Marple read the lines twice. The tone was clear. This was not a man abandoning his lover, but one pleading with her to flee a world that would never forgive her. The question, however, remained. Had Elena followed the plan, or had someone else discovered it first? The signature, Th, was firm but unadorned. There was no surname, no location, just a date, the week before the wedding, and the haunting hope of a future that, if it had come to pass, had come without witness. In a village such as Little Brackham, memory lives not only in documents and graveyards, but in the quiet corners of minds that have seen too much, and been asked to say too little. Miss Marple, possessing an unmatched skill in distinguishing fading memory from selective silence, called upon Miss Havers, once a parlor maid at the Gray household, and now retired in a modest bungalow near the church. Miss Havers, though frail, retained clarity where it counted. She remembered Elena, pale, polite, never rebellious, but always watchful. It was the father, she said, who ruled the household like a ledger, every hour accounted for, every visitor scrutinized. There had been rumors then of Elena's growing affection for a young man who worked in the gardens. Thomas Harrow, quiet, decent, with a soldier's bearing, and no prospects beyond his hands. Miss Havers had once delivered a letter for Elena. She had not read it, only slipped it into Thomas's coat pocket, where it hung on the servant's hook. Elena had looked afraid, but not of the gardener. It was her father she feared, and her cousin Margaret, who seemed always to know what Elena intended before she acted. Then, one morning, both Elena and Thomas were gone. Miss Havers had always believed they had run off together, but no confirmation ever came. Only silence, and the quiet replacement of Elena's portrait with Margaret's engagement announcement months later. Following Miss Havers's recollection, Miss Marple sought what records might exist concerning Thomas Harrow. In truth, there were few. He had arrived at Greyhoor Farm shortly before the wedding preparations began, a war veteran taken on as temporary help. His references had been respectable, though sparse. He had spoken little, beyond what was required. What struck Miss Marple was not the presence of records, but their absence. After the date of Elena's disappearance, no further trace of Harrow existed, not in parish rolls, nor in the employment ledgers. He had left neither debt nor possessions. No one remembered seeing him pack a bag or collect wages. He had simply ceased to be. Some in the village, when prompted delicately, recalled the gardener. A solemn sort, kept to himself, said one. Another described him as gentle with animals. There were no accusations, but there was something else, a quiet assumption that Harrow had been dismissed, that he had gone the way of many young men without family gone south, or to sea, or into the industrial haze of cities, where names were forgotten. Yet Miss Marple doubted such an end. His sudden absence, paired with Elena's, and now the discovery of the letter, all pointed to a man who had not fled, but protected. Whether he had succeeded, or whether he too had been silenced, remained to be seen. Still, the initials now had a name, and with it a possibility. Miss Marple's next visit was to Mr. Cresswell's office, ostensibly to clarify a minor detail about the church land boundaries. She asked her questions with characteristic precision, modestly dressed as ever, her handbag tucked primly beside her, but her eye, ever alert, fell upon an old ledger of annuity payments, one kept separate from the newer volumes. With a casual remark about how many parish widows had been kept afloat by forgotten trusts, she coaxed Cresswell into allowing her a glimpse. There, neatly entered in faded ink, was a payment line, beginning in 1912 and ceasing abruptly in 1917. The recipient, Mrs. E. Harrow. The amount modest but consistent. Miss Marple made no exclamation, no gasp. She merely nodded, as if remarking upon the steadiness of the handwriting. But inside, the pieces began to assemble. Evelina had not vanished without trace. She had become someone else, quietly, legally, and with just enough support to survive. The question that followed, however, was not where she had gone, but who had funded her going, and why they had kept it so scrupulously hidden. There are secrets buried beneath scandal, and then there are those tucked gently behind respectable curtains, preserved not out of shame, but necessity. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, her mind turned over the pattern, now forming with increasing clarity. The dress, the letter, the ribbon, the locket, all threads leading to Evelina's survival, and perhaps to her motherhood. But who had known? Who had ensured she was not left destitute? The payments must have been arranged by someone with access, discretion, and motive. Mr. Gray's sudden arrival now felt less accidental and more inevitable. Had he come seeking an inheritance, or the truth of his own beginning? And if Evelina had lived and borne a child and died quietly under another name, then someone in Little Brackham had known all along. Someone had helped. Someone had lied, and perhaps someone had killed to keep it buried. The trail that led Miss Marple away from Little Brackham was not lined with scandal or rumor, but with financial ledgers, the quiet signatures of those who preferred to leave footprints and figures rather than words. The name Mrs. E. Harrow, noted in the solicitor's books, had been associated with an annuity paid steadily between 1912 and 1917. The bank address listed was a rural one in Devon. It took little persuasion to have a cousin of Miss Marple's in Barnstable provide a modest introduction to the rector there, and thus, in due course, Miss Marple made her way to a small chapel residence, tucked into the folds of the Devonshire countryside. It was a quiet place, removed from the pressures of family name and local scrutiny. It had served once as a home for a curate, and later, as the lodgings of a widow, in reduced circumstances. The name Harrow was remembered by one of the vestry clerks, mostly because of a modest bequest made to the chapel fund upon her death. She had lived there with discretion and little interaction, save with a housekeeper, and she had been buried in the chapel grounds. Miss Marple requested permission to see the grave. She did not expect it to be elaborate, and it wasn't, but what it revealed could not have been louder, had it been etched in gold. It was a modest headstone, unadorned, save for the words, "Beloved Mother, 1889 to 1917. There was no surname, no scripture, and no mention of husband or child. But to Miss Marple, the absence of detail said more than any engraved eulogy. She stood before it quietly, her hands clasped. The dates aligned precisely. Evelina Gray would have been 22 when she vanished, and she would have been 28, just when she died here, far from the village that had judged and confined her. If this was indeed Evelina, and all signs now suggested it was, then she had lived for nearly 6 years, beyond her disappearance. Not as a scandal, but as a mother, hidden in grace and silence. The chapel groundskeeper, an elderly man with little interest in sentiment, confirmed the death had followed childbirth. The baby had survived. The mother had not. Miss Marple absorbed this, with the solemnity such revelations demanded. Evelina had not run away in disgrace. She had sacrificed comfort and inheritance to protect the life growing within her. She had given up her name, her family, and perhaps love itself, and had died, known only by those few who did not ask questions. But there was one who had remained, a child now grown, and if her deduction was correct, he had returned to the village, not in malice, but in search of his beginning, and perhaps of the mother he had never known. Miss Marple, in her customary fashion, requested a brief word with a woman who had once kept house at the chapel residence. Mrs. Holland was now well into her 90s, and resided at a nearby almshouse. Her mind sharp when prompted with specifics. She remembered Mrs. Harrow very clearly. She was kind. Mrs. Holland said softly, but quiet, liked her tea strong, and her letters private, always looking over her shoulder, as though someone might be following. Miss Marple asked about visitors. The old woman shook her head. Only the solicitor, once a year, left an envelope with the money. She never spoke of family, kept herself neat, sewed little jackets for the baby. It was the mention of the child that caused the housekeeper to pause. He was a lovely boy, soft dark hair. She used to sing to him in French, only when she thought no one was listening. When asked what became of him, the answer came simply, orphanage. She had no one to take him. The solicitor arranged it all, said it was better if no one knew. Miss Marple thanked her gently as she walked away. The weight of Elena's decision pressed upon her. Not shame, but sacrifice. A woman erased, not by scandal, but by silence, arranged and preserved. Yet even silence, once constructed, must be maintained. And someone somewhere had ensured. Elalina Harrow remained a ghost. The records at the local orphanage were sparse, but serviceable. A boy, unnamed on arrival, had been taken in late in 1917, just after the death of Elalina Harrow. The solicitor who had arranged it had used no family surname, merely stating that the mother had died in childbirth, and the father could not be traced. The boy, however, had been healthy, well-tempered, and eventually adopted by a couple from Sussex, the Greys. Not of the same Grey line as those in Little Brackham, at least not directly, but distant enough to allow the surname to pass unnoticed. Miss Marple read the ledger entry twice. The date matched, the location matched, and if the boy had grown up unaware of the full truth, it would explain Mr. Gideon Gray's delicate probing his obsession with Elalina and the undercurrent of personal urgency behind his questions. He was not merely a researcher. He was a son in search of a mother. The adoption, though lawful, had been orchestrated by someone familiar with Elalina's past and careful with its concealment. That level of care was not born of affection, Miss Marple suspected, but of necessity. Someone had been invested deeply in keeping Elalina's story buried, perhaps for legal reasons, perhaps to protect their own. And if Margaret Weatherby had known, perhaps that knowledge had been the true cause of her death. When Miss Marple returned to Little Brackham, she called upon Mr. Gray, with no ceremony. He welcomed her with a solemnity that suggested he already suspected what she might say. He listened as she spoke of the grave, the housekeeper, and the orphanage. He said nothing at first, only sat with his hands folded. Then, quietly, he admitted he had known, or at least feared, the truth for many years. There were letters, he said, odd, unsigned ones, that came with no return address. I was told not to ask, but I always felt I had been dropped into someone else's unfinished story. He had not come seeking property, he explained, nor inheritance. He had come seeking confirmation, a name, a grave, a thread to hold between his fingers. Miss Marple nodded. She believed him, but belief did not end suspicion. Someone else she knew had feared the same truth, and had been willing to end a life to keep it hidden. Among Elalina's preserved belongings, handed down discreetly by the chapel warden to Miss Marple after her visit, lay a bundle of small items. A child's woolen cap, a pressed sprig of lavender, and a second letter never sent. It was addressed simply, to Margaret if ever found. The handwriting was shakier than the first, the paper more worn. The words were shorter, clipped, strained. Elalina spoke of betrayal, of knowing her cousin had discovered the plan. She had feared interference, perhaps worse. The most chilling line lay near the bottom. I've decided not to wear the dress. If anything happens, remember this. I was never meant to disappear. Miss Marple folded the paper with care. This was not only a clue. It was a warning across time. And someone still among them, had ignored it. Miss Marple, who never underestimated the persuasive power of a teacup properly timed, suggested to the Reverend Ininsley that a gathering might be arranged in the church hall. A modest affair, nothing elaborate. Just a few of the parishioners and friends, for a light tea, to honor the recent restoration of the stained glass window, and incidentally, to welcome Mr. Gideon Gray properly. The vicar, always pleased to play host to neighborly civility, readily agreed. Invitations were issued without fuss. Mrs. Bantry baked a seed cake. Mrs. Cranley arranged flowers, with almost competitive precision. The setting, as Miss Marple intended, was entirely harmless. Quiet conversation, sponge cake, the faint shuffle of chairs, and no indication that anything extraordinary was to occur. Yet those who received their invitations knew better. Hugh Weatherby, frail and sight-dimmed, accepted with a murmur. Mr. Cresswell, the solicitor, came with punctuality and a faintly self-satisfied smile. Mrs. Cranley, though hesitant, arrived fashionably late, and Gideon Gray, his composure restrained, took his place, with an air of resigned anticipation. Miss Marple herself, quietly installed near the fireplace, offered no preamble. She merely poured tea with her usual steadiness and waited for conversation to reach its natural hush. Then she began, not with accusations or grand gestures, but with a simple observation. "Sometimes," she said, "a dress is not worn because it is never meant to be, and sometimes because someone else ensures that never will be." The atmosphere in the hall, though outwardly civil, held a tension that one might find in a parlor where the clock had stopped mid-chime. The guests, arranged with what appeared to be randomness, cast the occasional glance across teacups. Their smiles were forced, their conversation overly careful. Mr. Cresswell, in particular, exhibited a cheerfulness that slightly overreached itself. He complimented the lemon curd twice, and responded to neutral remarks with peculiar alacrity, as though eager to remain above suspicion or beneath notice. Mrs. Cranley confined herself to small talk, her eyes frequently seeking the vicar's for reassurance. Gideon Gray remained quiet, though watchful. His eyes moved not over the cakes or decorations, but across faces, stopping with particular interest on Cresswell, then on Hugh Weatherby, who had seated himself near the window and said very little. Miss Marple's gaze took them all in. She noted the small betrayals, the way Mr. Cresswell's fingers tapped slightly faster with each moment of silence, the way Mrs. Cranley avoided looking directly at Gideon, the faint frown that formed above Hugh's brow when the name Ellalinina was first mentioned, however lightly. The tea was poured, the clock chimed, and the biscuits were passed. But the air had shifted. It was no longer a gathering of neighbors. It was the quiet anticipation before a long-concealed truth chose its moment to rise. Miss Marple began in her usual manner, modestly, gently, and with a tone of quiet reflection rather than accusation. She spoke of fabric, of how stitches tell stories, when one knows how to read them. She mentioned the wedding dress found in the vestry chest, not with drama, but with mild wonder, as though it had merely caught her attention by chance. And then she spoke of Ellalinina Gray, of how a girl, pressured to marry and desperate to escape, had chosen to leave behind her name her village and her family, rather than surrender her future. The dress, she explained, had been left behind as a ruse, a decoy meant to delay discovery. Ellalinina had planned to flee with the man she loved and begin a quiet life elsewhere, for the sake of the child she carried. The letter sewn into the bodice, she said softly, had made this intention plain. It was signed Thomas Harrow, a man once employed at Greyhour Farm, now long forgotten. His name was never spoken in judgment, nor was Ellalinina's. She spoke of love, thwarted by control, of a plan born not of defiance, but of survival. And as her words wound through the room, like the slow unraveling of embroidery thread, no one dared interrupt, not until the tapestry she had begun to unpick began to show the shape of something far more troubling. There are thefts so subtle that they do not disturb the dust. Miss Marple's voice softened as she turned to the matter of Margaret Weatherby, the cousin who, in the eyes of the village, had merely stepped into the space left behind by a vanished girl. But Miss Marple said, what if that space had been taken deliberately? She described, without condemnation, how Margaret had known of Ellalinina's plan. A letter long forgotten and never sent had warned of the danger. Ellalinina, cautious, had changed her mind at the last moment and refused to wear the dress, an instinct, perhaps, born from fear or foresight. And Margaret, discovering the betrayal, had acted not with compassion, but with calculation. Miss Marple proposed, calmly, but with unwavering certainty, that Ellalinina had been intercepted not by accident, but by intention. That Margaret had removed her cousin from the narrative, not with violence, but with silence. A woman disappeared, her family honor preserved, and in time, her marriage accepted. The inheritance passed quietly. The husband was comforted, the locket worn, as though it had always belonged. But Ellalinina's life had not been lost. It had been stolen, her name buried beneath the weight of another's ambition. And now, decades later, with her son returned to claim not money, but memory, someone had grown afraid that the theft might finally be exposed. Margaret's death, Miss Marple explained, had not been the result of time or frailty, but of fear, expertly planted and deliberately cultivated. The letter she had received days before her collapse, forged in a familiar hand and phrased with unsettling precision, had been designed to mimic Ellalinina's voice, as though the dead had returned to speak. It had warned of revelation, of consequences, of unfinished matters soon to be unearthed. Margaret, already unsettled by Gideon's arrival and the reappearance of the wedding dress, had unraveled beneath the weight of her own conscience. Her heart had indeed failed, but not because of age, because of guilt, because of the terror that the life she had built on Ellalinina's erasure was finally cracking at the seams. She had gone out into the storm, clutching the locket, the dress, and her fears, and never returned. Miss Marple's voice fell to a hush. No one interrupted. The silence, long overdue, was finally listening. And then, almost as an afterthought, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mr. Cresswell, the solicitor who had arranged the annuity, overseen the estate, and facilitated the adoption. His involvement had always been explained away by duty. But duty, Miss Marple had long believed, was a convenient cloak for design. She pointed out the handwriting on the second letter, identical, upon close comparison, to that of old payment records. The forgeries, the annuity, the quiet transfer of funds, all bore his mark. He had orchestrated it all, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation, to hide a legal error, to cover a misappropriated inheritance, and perhaps once Margaret had learned the truth, to keep her silent by leveraging her own fear against her. Cresswell said nothing. His smile faded, not into panic, but into resignation. He had not expected to be outmaneuvered, least of all by an elderly lady with a fondness for flowers and a memory as sharp as steel. Miss Marple merely looked down into her teacup and remarked, "The truth, like cream, always rises, especially when stirred." It was Gideon who returned to Devon, unaccompanied and unannounced, with a small parcel beneath his arm and a name newly confirmed upon his heart. The chapel warden, informed of his purpose, made no difficulty. There had never been family to protest, nor ceremony to contradict. The grave-marked beloved mother had lain in solitude for decades, watched only by the wind and the whisper of chapel ivy. He did not erect a grand memorial. Instead, he placed a modest stone beside the first, slightly smaller, of polished slate, bearing only a name and a date. Eleanor Harrow, 1889 to 1917. Below it a single line, "Loved in silence, remembered in truth." No ceremony followed. No flowers were laid. But Gideon stood for a long time, his hands clasped before him, as though introducing himself to someone whose voice he had always imagined, but never heard. Miss Marple, hearing of the visit from the chapel clerk some days later, made no comment. She believed, quite firmly, that some reunions did not require witnesses, only peace. And the stone, though simple, marked not only a grave, but the quiet correction of a name denied for too long. Ellalinina Gray had never vanished. She had been buried, not in the ground, but in silence. And now, at last, she had been spoken for. Following the revelations, the matter of inheritance, once hidden beneath legal pretexts and ethical evasions, was addressed with the careful gravity it deserved. Mr. Cresswell, now removed from practice and under formal inquiry, made a quiet confession in exchange for leniency, citing pressure, secrecy, and fear of scandal in the years following Ellalinina's disappearance. The estate, long since diminished, was placed into a modest trust. Gideon, as Elenina's rightful heir, declined any personal enrichment beyond covering the legal costs and placing funds toward the maintenance of the chapel grounds in Devon. The wedding dress, once folded into a cedar chest and thought forgotten, was given a different fate. Miss Marple suggested it be preserved, not for fashion, nor spectacle, but for remembrance. It was presented to the small local history room at St. Mildred's, accompanied by a short note, unsigned, which spoke of women who had once lived in shadow, and of the stories found in seams. Visitors often paused before it, noting the elegant stitching, the slight discoloration near the bodice, the air of stillness it carried. Few knew its full tale, and none were told the whole. But it remained, not as a relic of romance, but as a testament to all that had been nearly erased, and now carefully restored. Hugh Weatherby's passing, which followed soon after the events at the church hall, was marked by neither drama nor surprise. He had grown quieter in recent weeks, eating less, sleeping more, his mind often drifting to places unnamed. When Eddie the maid found him one morning, still in his chair, with a shawl drawn over his knees and the remains of a letter in his lap, there was no sorrow, only the hush that comes when the last candle in a darkened room quietly extinguishes itself. He had never spoken of Eleanor again, nor had he spoken of Margaret in the days following the truth's unveiling. But he had, one afternoon, asked Eddie to fetch the old locket from the drawer, and had stared at it for a long time, before placing it into a small wooden box, marked simply E.G. Miss Marple heard the news, while tending to her roses. She nodded once, not in grief, but in understanding. He had carried the weight of two women's disappearances, one through deceit, the other through consequence. He had not orchestrated either, but had allowed both to pass beneath his roof, unquestioned. In the end, perhaps he had hoped that silence would protect him. But silence, as Miss Marple knew too well, is never a reliable shield. Spring returned to Little Brackham, with its usual modest splendor, daffodils along the lane, fresh ivy on the church wall, and the first bloom of roses in Miss Marple's garden. It was beneath one such bush, pale pink, and slightly wild, that she and Mrs. Bantry sat with teacups and cautious satisfaction. They spoke, as they often did, of gardens, of the new curate's unfortunate sermons, and of the upcoming charity jumble. But threaded gently beneath the surface was the knowledge that something had changed, not in the village itself, which remained stubbornly the same, but in its memory. Mrs. Bantry, always one for firm opinions, remarked that no one had ever quite trusted Margaret Weatherby. She had smiled too often and never said quite enough. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Instead, she stirred her tea and remarked upon how, in certain gardens, some roots grow tangled and strangle others if left unchecked. Then they sat quietly, as old friends do, when words have reached their limit. The breeze rustled the rose leaves, and the scent of new blooms drifted over the fence. Some stories, Miss Marple thought, must be dug up like old bulbs, not to shame, but to understand. And in understanding, a garden, or a village, may find its bloom again. In her sitting room, as the shadows lengthened, and the teapot cooled, Miss Marple reflected once more on the dress. It had not spoken, not in the way newspapers demand, or scandal prefers, but it had carried, within its stitches, the quiet persistence of a truth that refused to be forgotten. The seam, uneven and thickened, had said what no one else dared. It had spoken of a girl denied choice, a child hidden in shame, and a woman who had feared the wrong people. It had borne the weight of betrayal and of love, and it had waited patiently for hands gentle enough to listen. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out at the garden just beyond the sill. The truth, she murmured to no one in particular, has a way of clinging to thread, however tightly we sew the seams. And beyond the window, the roses stirred, pale, persistent, and impossibly alive. Thank you for staying with us through this tapestry of secrets, where a single wedding dress held the memory of a vanished bride, a hidden child, and a truth long buried beneath silence and storm. As Miss Marple so gently reminded us, time does not erase the past. It only tucks it into quieter corners, waiting for a steady hand to draw back the curtain. Eleanor's voice was almost lost, stitched inside the seams of a gown, silenced by fear, and blurred by the polite forgetfulness of village life. And yet, Through small acts of remembrance, quiet courage, and Miss Marple's tireless attention to detail, justice found its way home, not with scandal or spectacle, but in simple acts. A headstone restored, a name reclaimed, and a life honored, not for its tragedy, but for its truth. It makes one wonder, if you discovered a letter sewn into the lining of an old dress, would you open it? Or would you leave its secrets where time had hidden them?